Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين بإحسان إلى بعد. Welcome back for another lesson on Waraqat of Imam al-Haramain al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni. Picking up where we left off, last week we had discussed the categories of Ahkam and some of the issues related to the categories of Ahkam. And so Imam al-Haramain has listed the 5 essential categories of Ahkam: Taklifiyya, Wajib, Mandub, Mubah, Mahdhur, Makruh, Sahih, Mahdhur and Makruh. So these 5 are known as Ahkam Taklifiyya. Then we have what are known as Ahkam Wad'iyya, of which he has listed Sahih and Batil. I wanted to actually touch on Makruh and Khilaf al-Awla again. We talked about it last week, but in hindsight, looking back, I felt that that our discussion may have possibly left on a bit of a confusing note, and so I wanted to revisit this. Discussion briefly. Firstly, most Usuliyin do not mention Khilaf al-Awla, and this is you're more likely to find this in earlier works. Imam Tajuddin al-Subki, Ibn al-Subki, has proposed that it is in fact a 6th category and should be considered separate to Makruh. So Makruh would be a particular category, and Khilaf al-Awla is a particular category. So Makruh would not be called Khilaf al-Awla, and Khilaf al-Awla then would not be called Makruh. However, most Usuliyin have rejected this view, or opposed Imam Tajuddin al-Subki in this view. So for the majority of them, Khilaf al-Awla is a subcategory, and it comes back to what we talked about, that Mandub essentially is the opposite of Makruh. So if we've been instructed to do something that is Mandub, that is Mustahab, leaving that would then be Makruh. Except this raises a bit of a dilemma. For example, at the moment, there are many adhkar that are recommended, that are mustahab, that I could be doing, but I'm not. La ilaha illallah, alhamdulillah, Allahu akbar, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, ila akhir salat al-Ibrahimiyya, subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah al-azim. I could be reading Quran, I'm not reading Quran. I could be praying, in this case where I am at the moment, I'm actually in Waqt Nahi, it's after Asr. But assuming that it was not after Asr, and it was not Waqt Nahi, then it would be mustahab for me to pray. I'm not praying. Tanafful al-mutlaq, general nafil. I'm not at the moment in the act of visiting an ill person. I'm sure there's plenty of ill people here in Makkah that I could be visiting at the moment, if I chose to. There's always janazas going on in Makkah, after, particularly in the Haram, after every single prayer. I could be following a janaza. I'm not following a janaza. So the list of actions that are mustahab or mandub that I'm not doing at the moment is endless, right? Not clearly then, it would be absurd to say that I'm doing something makruh, something khilaf al-awla even, by not doing any of these things at the moment, because the meaning of that would be that every single one of us at any given time is immersed in all sorts of makruhat. This is why Imam al-Juwayni in I believe this quote is coming from his Nihayat al-Matlab, but Zarkashi quotes it in al-Bahr al-Muhit. He says, إنما يقال ترك الأولى إذا ترك الأولى إذا كان منضبطا كالضحى وقيام الليل وما لا تحديد له ولا ضابط من المندوبات لا يسمى تركه مكروها وإلا لكان الإنسان في كل وقت ملابسا للمكروهات الكثيرة من حيث إنه لم يقم فيصلي ركعتين ويعود مريضا ونحوه. So he says that we only call something as leaving that which is better or makruh or what have you if it's something that is mundabit, something that is, you know, somehow defined, it has a particular time frame, or it has, you know, particular circumstances for which it is recommended, and then you don't do it. It might be perfectly fine for you not to do it, but it is not the ideal. It's interesting in his quote that he actually does not distinguish between, he uses the term tark al-awla and makruh interchangeably. So he says that, you know, in these sorts of things that are undefined, this is not called makruh at all. وإلا لكان الإنسان في كل وقت ملابسا للمكروهات الكثيرة. Otherwise, at all times, every single person would be guilty of all sorts of makruhat. Because, you know, he's not getting up and praying to rak'ahs, he's not visiting a sick person, etc. So this clearly goes outside of our discussion of khilaf al-awla and makruh. But something that you know, at this moment is recommended for you to do, the situation that you're in is recommended for you, and you choose not to do it. This then is where our discussion of khilaf al-awla and makruh in terms of leaving mandubat, this is where it lies. This quote is from Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, but it is quoted by Zarkashi in al-Bahr al-Muhit. I haven't taken it from Imam al-Haramain from a direct source. I've taken from al-Bahr al-Muhit. Zarkashi mentions this quote under the discussion of Makruh and Khilaf al-Awla in al-Bahr al-Muhit. I believe the quote is coming from Nihayat al-Matlab, which is Imam al-Juwayni's compendium on Shafi'i. So clearly then, this is not makruh or khilaf al-awla in these situations that I described. It comes up when it is something specific and definable. Say that at this situation or in these circumstances, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is what is the ideal to be doing, and it is applicable to you, you know, in a specific sense right now, but you're choosing not to do it. That would be khilaf al-awla or makruh, depending on how you're doing these terms. For Ibn Subki, for Tajuddin Subki and scholars who followed him, khilaf al-awla then is a separate category. It's a separate category. So these sorts of things would be called khilaf al-awla, they would not be called. Whereas for the majority, and we saw this in the quote that I quoted from al-Juwayni, and basically this would be applicable to anyone pre-Tajuddin Subki, because as far as I'm aware, Tajuddin Subki, yeah, I'm pretty sure Tajuddin Subki is the first to propose that this is actually a separate category. So before him, they might use the terms tark al-awla, khilaf al-awla, interchangeably with makruh. Interchangeably with makruh. So these things could be described as being makruh. So in terms of the relationship between makruh and khilaf al-awla, we have this lovely diagram that I've made. I think it's basically you have this broader circle. This is makruh in the broader sense. The big circle is makruh in the broader sense. And so khilaf al-awla is a subcategory. And so khilaf al-awla could be called makruh. Khilaf al-awla could be called makruh. But you will find sometimes the fuqaha will say about an issue, this thing is makruh. And another group of scholars in the madhab will say, no, actually it's khilaf al-awla. Or someone will say it's khilaf al-awla, and another will say, oh no, it's makruh. It's not khilaf al-awla, it's makruh. So they make a distinction between the two. This is in spite of the fact that they consider khilaf al-awla to be a subcategory of makruh. So there is then basically a we have makruh in the broader sense. We have makruh in the specific sense. So sometimes makruh would be used in a way to contrast it with khilaf al-awla, and sometimes it would be used interchangeably with khilaf al-awla, because in its broader sense, it includes khilaf al-awla. And to recap on what is the difference between khilaf al-awla and makruh in the specific sense, there's sort of different approaches to defining this term, and there is some ambiguity in the discussions of Usuliyin about how exactly the distinction is made. However, basically, the idea is that something for which there is a specific prohibition would then be makruh. But something that does not have a specific prohibition, but you're leaving off a command. You're leaving off a command. This is called khilaf al-awla. Khilaf al-awla. However, it seems to me that that this explanation, this is the standard explanation, there is still some ambiguity surrounding it. There's still some problems surrounding it. If you look at the way that the terms are used by the fuqaha, I'm not totally convinced about this explanation. But suffice it to say that this is what has been mentioned by the Usuliyin. There are some who, well, I'll just skip over the discussion. But basically, to keep it simple, khilaf al-awla it's basically comes back to the idea of what we discussed before, that makruh is darajat, haram is also darajat, wajibat are darajat. There are varying levels of emphasis. So khilaf al-awla is basically the slightest level of makruh. So that would be the clearest way to understand the distinction between the two. In any case, I hope I haven't confused you more. My hope is that this helps clarify what we discussed a little bit last week about Makruh and Khilaf al-Awla. Okay, so all right, so now we have Sahih and Batil. I wanted to look at Sahih and Batil again, just briefly, because we didn't really explain them very clearly in our last lesson. Sort of rushed through it. Sahih and Batil. So basically, when we say that something is Sahih, basically this means that this action is valid and it is effective. Effective meaning it takes effect. And this is when all of the conditions have been met for its validity. And then the opposite of that is batil, or alternatively, you will find that the term fasid is used. So something that is fasid or batil, then is invalid and ineffective. So if we look at ibadat as an example, if you perform prayer at Salat at Asr time, you perform the prayer, you fulfilled all of the necessary conditions for your prayer to be valid, your obligation then is fulfilled. Your obligation then is fulfilled. You no longer are bound to perform this prayer. This obligation is no longer binding on you because it has been fulfilled. But if you perform the prayer and you missed one of its conditions, so for example, you did something that invalidated. So for example, you prayed not realizing that you're not in wudu. This prayer, in fact, then is invalid, and the obligation is not fulfilled, and it must be repeated. This also applies to contracts and transactions. You have, for example, a valid sale. When you have a transaction, a sale, if the conditions are met and we deem this sale to be valid, then this sale effectively transfers ownership of the two items that have been exchanged. So if it's merchandise for an amount of money, this amount of money now goes into this person's ownership. This merchandise goes into the other person's ownership. And an invalid transaction, this does not happen. This transfer of ownership does not happen. Then we have marriage contracts is another example of contracts. So a marriage contract that is valid makes marital relations lawful. And the rights and obligations that are created by marriage then binding. Whereas an invalid marriage contract does not have any of these effects because it is null and void. It is as if it doesn't exist. Generally speaking, you will find in the books of Usul al-Fiqh, Batil and Fasid are treated as interchangeable terms by the Jumhur. In contrast to Hanafis, Hanafis have slightly different usage of these terms and they make a distinction between the two. With that said, there is, however, some variation across different chapters of fiqh. So you will find sometimes even the Jumhur, Shafi'is, Malikis, and Hanbalis will sometimes distinguish between the two terms when discussing specific chapters of fiqh. So, for example, a nikah fasid, nikah that is described as fasid, this is one in which there are valid differences of opinion, such as nikah without a wali. So some scholars consider this a condition for validity of nikah, while others do not. So those who consider it a condition for the validity of nikah would describe such a nikah as fasid, not batil, in the books of fiqh. Whereas they reserve the term nikah batil for those marriage contracts that are invalid by consensus. For example, a person marrying a fifth wife when he's already married to 4 women, meaning simultaneously. Obviously, if he's a divorced one and he only has 3 wives at the time, he can marry another one, regardless of whether she's the 5th, 6th, or however it's intended here is marrying a 5th wife simultaneously to being married to 4 other women. This is invalid by consensus. So these are differences in terminology. As a general rule, differences in terminology are not a matter of tarjih, meaning there's not a stronger opinion. There's not a stronger opinion to say that batil and fasid are interchangeable terms, or batil and fasid are terms with two different meanings. It's simply one group of scholars uses this terminology and another group of scholars uses this terminology. Where judgment of one opinion being stronger than the other applies is when there's actual difference in the ahkam fiqhiyya and not in the terminology that is being used to frame those ahkam. So the distinction that is made between batil and fasid, for example, I didn't really want to get into it, but the Hanafis distinguish between batil and fasid in a certain fashion. It's not relevant to tarjih in this issue. It's not relevant to determining the stronger opinion, what term they're using for what meaning, and the fact that they're using it in a fashion that is different from the majority. It is the ahkam that they're building on that terminology. When they apply them to a specific issue and say the hukam is such and such, the question is, does the evidence from the sharia for this particular opinion and the ahkam that are built on it, does the evidence support this opinion, or is the evidence in support of the other opinion on this issue stronger? And sometimes differences in terminology will in fact be a reflection of differences in fiqh. It would be a reflection of differences in fiqh. And so the question then still is this difference in fiqh, in fiqhi ruling, is which of these opinions is stronger? The question is not which of the terminologies is stronger. Okay, so now this brings us to a discussion of certain epistemological terms. So we have fiqh. Al-Fiqh akhassu min al-ilm. In other words, the term fiqh is more specific than the general term ilm. And according to the commentators of al-Waraqat, what is meant by this is that the term ilm applies to various ulum, various sciences. So nahu is an ilm, tafsir is an ilm, and so forth. So fiqh is one of those ulum, is one of those sciences. So in that sense, it is more specific. Fiqh, here we are not talking about the istilahi meaning of fiqh. You might remember that fiqh has a linguistic meaning, which is simply understand. And it has an istilahi meaning, which is ma'rifatul ahkam al-shar'iyya allati tariquha al-ijtihad. The knowledge of ahkam shar'iyya that are arrived at by ijtihad. And there's various definitions that have been given, but this is the definition that Imam al-Juwayni has used here in al-Waraqat. Al-Fiqh akhassu min al-ilm. Then he says, وَالْعِلْمُ مَعْرِفَةُ الْمَعْلُومِ عَلَى مَا هُوَ بِهِ فِي الْوَاقِعِ. Ilm is to know something as it actually is in reality, في الواقع. So in other words, what you conceive about something is in fact matching its reality. So it's true. This is ilm. This is ilm. It's worth noting that this definition would be more complete if we were to add something to it. So if we were to say al-ilmu ma'rifat al-ma'lumi ala ma huwa bihi fil waqi' ma'rifatan jazima, that would be a better definition. Why do we add ma'rifat and jazm with certain knowledge? This will become clear when you see the later terms, because you have Zann. Zann is where you have an idea of what something is, but without certainty. Although this is not necessary. This is not necessary because the contrast between the different terms that is being used, it does sufficiently make clear what is. So now we have the next term that Imam al-Haramain defines, al-Jahl. Al-Jahl تصور الشيء على خلاف ما هو به في الواقع. Jahl is, as he defines it, to conceive of something being other than it actually is, other than it is in reality. And it seems that this definition is actually the definition of what is known as al-Jahl al-Murakkab. Al-Jahl al-Murakkab. Jahl is oftentimes divided into two categories, al-Jahl al-Basit and al-Jahl al-Murakkab. Al-Jahl al-Basit is just simple ignorance and compound ignorance. So simple ignorance is simply to not know. Someone asks you something, you say, I don't know. That's simple ignorance. Whereas, someone asks you, who is the author? So to give a practical example, someone asks you, who is the author of al-Waraqat? You've never heard of al-Waraqat before, so you have no idea who the author of al-Waraqat. So I don't know. This is Jahl Basit. You don't, it's simply lack of knowledge of concerning something. Jahl Murakkab would be when you don't know the piece of information, and on top of that, you think you do, but you've got it wrong. So you have Adam al-Ilm, the lack of knowledge, plus you have what is mentioned here, تصور الشيء على خلاف ما هو به, to imagine something as other than what it actually is. So someone says, who is the author of al-Waraqat? You say, well, isn't it Ibn Hazm? Ibn Hazm wrote al-Waraqat, correct? That would be Jahl Murakkab, and might even be, it's definitely Ibn Hazm. I know what I'm talking about, and you don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm sure that it's Ibn Hazm, and all the ulama say that it's Ibn Hazm, and I don't know where you got that it's al-Juwayni. That would be Jahl Murakkab. So Jahl is of two categories, Jahl Basit and Jahl Murakkab. He then goes on to explain that ilm has two categories, al-ilm al-Daruri and al-ilm al-Muktasab. This is al-ilm al-Daruri, ما لا يقع عن نظر واستدلال كالعلم الواقع بإحدى الحواس الخمس. You'll see here that it's been translated as immediate knowledge. Ilm Daruri basically is necessary knowledge. And you'll oftentimes hear an expression that, this is known from the religion by necessity. Al-ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura comes back to this concept of ilm daruri. And basically the idea is, let's take a look at how you find it. Ma la yaqa'u an nazar wastidlal. It is something that does not, it is knowledge that does not result from rational or evidentiary inquiry. So in other words, it's not dependent on study, contemplation, examination of evidence. It is immediate, automatic. It comes to you daruratan. Like knowledge that is known by one of the five senses. So for example, if you were to walk out at Dhuhr time on a bright, hot, sunshiny day? Do you need any process of logical deduction or examination of evidence to reflect and contemplate? Is it daytime right now or is it nighttime? No, it comes to you automatically. This knowledge that it is daytime, it comes to you automatically. In fact, if you were to try and prevent it, you couldn't. You cannot make yourself doubt that it is daytime, unless you are afflicted with some sort of mental illness, or have very, very deep epistemological doubt, such as the idea that that some people have, that perhaps that this entire existence around us is not even real. How do we know that it's real? How these are basically questions that some philosophers have raised. But this knowledge is something that it comes to you naturally and immediately. That is basically the idea of ilm daruri. It doesn't require study and examination of evidence and deduction. Some manuscripts add here العلم الواقع بإحدى الحواس الخمس أو بالتواتر, that which is known by tawatur. Tawatur is mass transmission. And the example that is frequently given is, for example, I know that China exists. I've never been to China. I've never seen it. But I know that it exists. Why do I know that it exists? Because the knowledge of it, the reports concerning its existence, are so widespread that it's not possible for me to have doubt about it. Like if I try and make it's coming back to the idea of Ilm Daruri being something that you cannot deny. You simply can't. You can't make yourself doubt because it's just overwhelmingly clear. So if someone were if I was to try and convince myself that that maybe it's a conspiracy theory, there's no place called China, and that NASA just created this because they wanted us to believe that the world is round or something like that, I just can't. I mean, maybe that's not the best example because there are probably people who could, but that's not the best explanation. But still, nonetheless, it's something that is so clear. It's so well reported, so widespread, this information, that it is undeniable. And so it's a type of report that produces certain knowledge by necessity. It necessarily produces certain knowledge because it's not something that requires an extensive process of Nazar and Istidlal. So this is Ilm Daruri. Some of the commentators mention a third category of Ilm Daruri. You have Ilm Daruri coming from the five senses, from experience. You have Ilm Daruri that is coming from Tawatur, from mass transmission. And you have Ilm Daruri coming from what is known as Badihatul Aql, things that are rational points that are extremely obvious. Like, for example, the idea that 2 is more than 1. It's immediate, it's obvious. It doesn't require another and Istidlal. If someone gives me a long number and a long multiplication problem, with many steps, I can arrive at the answer with certainty, ilm, yaqeen. But it requires nazar. It requires istidlal. But if somebody tells me 2 plus what's 2 plus 2, the answer comes to me automatically 4. I can't make myself not know that the answer is 4. I just can't. This is Ilm Daruri, because it is something that is known by way of reason, but it is something that is so clear and self-evident that it does not require another investigation. Then we have al-Ilm al-Muktasab, al-Ilm al-Muktasab, which is sometimes called al-Ilm al-Nazar. Here he is referred to it as al-Ilm al-Muktasab. Ilm Muktasab, you'll note that it's been transliterated here as al-Muktasab. It should be Muktasab. And up here above, you have Jahl. Should be without that second A. This should be. Okay, so Ilm Muktasab is ilm that is dependent on Nazar and Istidlal, rational inquiry based on examination of evidence. It requires the use of reasoning, oftentimes multi-step reasoning. This is Ilm Muktasab or Ilm Nadari. It's certain, but it is of a level of certainty that is not the same as Ilm Daruri. And the reason is because one is dependent on another istidlal, and the other one is not dependent on another istidlal. So Nazar here defines as al-Fiqh fi hal al-manzuri fi. It is contemplating, reflecting on the object of this rational inquiry. And istidlal is talab al-dalil, is the process of seeking evidence, finding evidence for a premise, for a claim. والدليل هو المرشد إلى المطلوب. The dalil, just defining the terms that have been used here, because we said that this is the difference between Ilm Daruri and Ilm Muktasab. The difference between Ilm Daruri and Ilm Muktasab. Ilm Daruri is not dependent on another in Istidlal. Ilm Muktasab is dependent on another in Istidlal, so he defines another in Istidlal. He defines Istidlal as talab al-dalil, so therefore he defines dalil, the seeking of dalil. So what is dalil? Dalil is what leads to the hukm that is sought, the ruling that is sought, the conclusion that is sought, or the answer to the inquiry that is sought. And then he brings these last two terms. Zann, تجويز أمرين أحدهما أظهر من الآخر. والشك تجويز أمرين لا مزية لأحدهما على الآخر. So Zann is acknowledging two possibilities, one of which is more probable than the other, one of which is more likely than the other. So this is what is known as al-Dhann al-Rajih, that this text, for example, has two possible interpretations. The stronger interpretation is this one, is the first one. The weaker interpretation is the second one. The stronger one, we would say this is Dhann Rajih. This is preponderant, the preponderant belief, stronger belief. And then you have Dhann Marjuh, which is acknowledges a possibility, but it is a weaker possibility. And then he says you have the last term is Shakk. Shakk is acknowledging of two possibilities, neither of which is superior to the other. Neither of which is superior to the other. And so this is when you have multiple possibilities, but they're equal. Multiple possibilities, they're equal. So you are not able to reach a conclusion even with Zann or Ghalabatul Zann. Ghalabatul Zann meaning this is something that you feel confident that this is most likely the case without reaching the level of certainty. And Shakk would be when you have two possibilities that are equal. So you are doubtful about the matter. You know this thing could be permissible or not permissible, for example, but you are doubtful. These terms, these categories, ilm, and also with ilm you have qat' and yaqeen. These are basic synonyms. Ilm, qat', yaqeen, things that are qat'i, things that are yaqeeni, and then zann. And the distinction between yaqeen and zann. This is an extremely important concept that you will find repeats in the discussions of the Usuliyin. Maybe not here in al-Waraqat so much, but as you move forward in your studies of Usul al-Fiqh, you'll find that these concepts frequently come up. It's worth noting here that Imam al-Haramain defined fiqh معرفة الأحكام الشرعية التي طريقها الاجتهاد. The knowledge of Ahkam Sharia, which can be known by way of ijtihad. So there are ahkam that can be known without ijtihad. There are ahkam that can be known without ijtihad. So for example, the obligation of the 5 daily prayers, the obligation of zakah, the obligation of fasting Ramadan, the obligation of hajj, the prohibition of zina, the prohibition of drinking alcohol, the prohibition of eating pork, the prohibition of murder, the prohibition of theft. All of these things are known to all Muslims. And there's not any doubt about them. They don't have any doubt about them. And they're not dependent in their knowledge of them on the mufti, on the fatwa of a mujtahid scholar. In this respect, the mujtahid and the non-mujtahid, the scholar and the layman are equal in their knowledge of these basic fundamental rulings that are well known. And these are typically, as I alluded to earlier, these are what are typically known as al-ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura. Those ahkam, the knowledge of which is evident to all Muslims. You might have rare exceptions to that. Someone is a new Muslim. Someone has grown up in a very isolated environment where there's not a lot of Muslims around, and so things that are obvious and universally known to the average Muslim will be oblivious to them. So you get these sorts of exceptions to happen, but generally speaking, these things are ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura. They don't require ijtihad to arrive at. So in explaining this, and many commentators have said that when Imam al-Haramain, when he defined fiqh, his purpose in defining fiqh was to say that what makes a person a faqih is not his knowledge of ahkam, because the layman knows these ahkam that are ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura with yaqeen. He knows them. He's not dependent on someone else to arrive at them. He's not dependent on a scholar telling him the ruling is this, the ruling is that. He knows them. But that doesn't make him a faqih. What makes a person a faqih is the knowledge of issues that depend on ijtihad. And so a number of scholars, in commenting on this, they've said that, well, his definition then excludes issues, or sorry, it limits fiqh to issues that are zanni. Limits issues to fiqh to issues that are zanni. And so only those issues can be truly described as fiqh. However, I think it's possible that he intends qat'i ahkam that require ijtihad. Didn't we say that you have ilm daruri and ilm nazari? So there are many ahkam that scholars know with certainty. For example, many of the details of the ahkam of mawarith are agreed on. There is ijma concerning them. The ayat of the Quran are clear concerning them. And so to many scholars, they will be known with certainty. But that is because of their knowledge of evidences, they're able to reach that certainty. Because of their ability to do istidlal, their ability to do ijtihad, that they're able to arrive at certainty concerning this, whereas the layman is not. So I don't think that his definition necessarily was intended to exclude all qat'iyat, all yaqiniyat, all matters of certainty. A last note, many of the issues of fiqh that are mentioned in the books of fiqh are zanni. And books of fiqh and discussions of the fuqaha tend to focus a lot on khilaf, which is fine because that is the purpose that they were laid out, was to attempt to reach conclusions on these issues. But it's possible sometimes to lose sight of how much is qat'i in our religion. How many of the things, fundamental teachings of our religion are in fact known with certainty, and the evidence for them is certain, is ilmi, qat'i, yaqini. And this is an interesting passage from Imam al-Shatibi in al-Muwafaqat. It's actually a couple of pages. He starts talking about the general awamir, the general commands and general prohibitions in the sharia. And he gives a long list of them. And I'll just sort of read them off. Adl, ihsan, al-wafa bil-ahd, justice, being good to others, fulfilling promises, الأخذ بالعفو من الأخلاق الإرادة الجاهل الصبر الشكر مواساة ذي القربى والمساكين والفقراء, helping your relatives and the needy and the poor, being moderate in spending, بالتي هي أحسن, the command to, or the encouragement to repel, someone who is wronging you with, by doing that which is better, by doing taking a better course of action, by taking a kinder course of action. Khawf and raja, fear and hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, giving full measure, full weight in your business dealings, following the straight path, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, doing righteous deeds, staying upright and firm on guidance, responding to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he calls you, being fearful of him, pardoning others, lowering one's wing to the believers, meaning being humble with them, calling to the path of Allah, making dua for the believers, being sincere, entrusting your affairs to Allah, turning away from idle talk and false speech, guarding trusts that have been given to you, praying in the night, supplicating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having trust in him, having zuhd in the dunya, asceticism, seeking the akhirah, turning to Allah, commanding good, forbidding evil. He's just listing things that have general awamir that have come up in the sharia. Taqwa, humility, having a recognition of your need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, purifying yourself, always giving true judgments. Al-hukm bil-haq basically means not being unjust in your giving a judgment, following that which is best, repenting of sins, ishfaq, qiyam bishahada, fulfilling, giving testimony, seeking refuge in Allah from the whispers of shaitan, التبتل, حجر الجاهلين, تعظيم الله, glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, التذكر, taking lesson or remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, acknowledging the blessings that you've been given, tilawat al-Quran, recitation of Quran, assisting one another in truth, honesty, being mindful of your deeds, mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is watching you, speaking good words, rushing to do good, suppressing and controlling your anger, keeping the ties of kinship, turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam at times of dispute, submitting to Allah's command, being firm in matters, staying silent, holding on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rectifying people's relationships, fixing people's relationships, loving for the sake of Allah, being severe with the kuffar, merciful to the believers, and charity. هذا كله في المأمورات. أما المنهيات, and then now he's going to list the prohibitions. الظلم, الفحش, أكل مال اليتيم, consuming the wealth of the orphan, following paths of misguidance, being wasteful, sin in general, being heedless of Allah, being arrogant, being satisfied with the dunya over the akhirah, feeling safe from Allah's plotting, dividing into different groups and sects, transgression against others, despairing of Allah's mercy, being ungrateful for blessings, rejoicing in the worldly life, meaning in the sense of only being concerned about it and bragging about it and loving it, and cheating in weights and measures, spreading corruption in the earth, following one's forefathers blindly, transgression, in being inclined to the oppressors or the wrongdoers, turning away from reminders, violating one's covenants, doing that which is rejected and objectionable, mistreating your parents, following speculation, meaning on religious matters, baseless speculation, walking arrogantly in the land, obeying those who followed their hawa, associating others with Allah in worship, following your lusts, turning people from the path of Allah, and so on and so forth. Another one that he mentions, اتباع الصدقة بالمن والأذى. You give someone charity and then you take that as an opportunity to remind them that hey, you owe me. I've done this favor for you, and you use that to nuisance them. This then is something that is prohibited. Jealousy, refusing Allah's hukum, being satisfied or pleased with the hukum of other than Allah, with the hukum of Taghut, being weak in front of enemies, treachery, accusing the innocent of sin. It goes on and on. Giving bribes so as to attain a false judgment, meaning a court judgment, commanding the evil, prohibiting the good, forgetting Allah, hypocrisy, worshipping Allah on an edge. Ibadatullahi ala harf basically means that worshiping Allah simply because He's giving you good, such that if He stops, you will stop. Suspicion, spying, backbiting, and swearing false oaths. Now, the reason that he mentioned these was actually in the course of mentioning you have many general commands and prohibitions, the details of which might be disputed or the details of which might be explained elsewhere, and he gave examples of them. But the purpose I'm using this for is to show that there's actually so many things in our religion that are clear. There's so many things in our religion that are clear and are well defined. And so, the fact that many of the ahkam of fiqh are matters of ikhtilaf, and that they're zanni, is not cause for concern, because the more important something is, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will go out of His way to make it clear in our religion and in the sources of our religion. So there's no fear of the teachings of Islam being lost in the fact that it's ahkam of fiqh or dhanni, subject to speculation, subject to difference of opinion, subject to ijtihad. Just very quickly, take a look at Usul al-Fiqh. Usul al-Fiqh is the means of fiqh and the method of Istidlal. We'll come back to this, wrap up with this week. We'll revisit this. And then he lists the chapters of Usul al-Fiqh. He says Usul al-Fiqh, Abwab Usul al-Fiqh, basically these are the topics of Usul al-Fiqh. This is not a comprehensive list, but these are what he's going to cover. And so he's going to give a brief overview of the main essential issues of Usul al-Fiqh, categories of speech, commands and prohibition, al-am and al-khas, general and specific, mujmal and mubayyin, the summarized and the elaborated. Summarized is perhaps not the best translation for mujmal. Mujmal is probably better translated as something that is it has a degree of ambivalence or ambiguity. Zahir is the apparent words that give their apparent meaning, give an apparent meaning, while being open to other interpretations. Af'al, actions of the Prophet ﷺ, because we derive ahkam not just from the words of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, but also from the actions of the Prophet ﷺ. Then we have abrogation, nasikh and mansukh. So you have texts that are abrogating and texts that are abrogated. You have ijma', consensus, al-akhbar, which is basically dealing with some principles for critiquing reports, and this is basically the domain of the hadith sciences, the domain of hadith sciences. So it's important to when studying usul fiqh to look at what different scholars of usul fiqh have to say about al-akhbar, or the conditions for acceptance of akhbar, and then also compare that with what has been said in the books of ulum al-hadith. Then you have tartib al-adilla, which is basically how to deal with conflicting evidence, how to reconcile them, how to basically weigh conflicting evidences. Sifat al-mufti wal-mustafti, which is basically dealing with the characteristics of the mufti, who is issuing fatwa or legal opinion, and the mustafti, which is the person who is seeking a fatwa. And finally, the rulings of the mujtahid, the rulings of the mujtahid scholars who practice ijtihad. This is basically his brief overview of the issues that are going to be covered. We don't really have much to say about this. What I did want to look at, however, briefly, is this categorization of topics. We'll have opportunity to come back and revisit this next week. This is basically how Ghazali in al-Mustasfa has categorized the topics of Usul al-Fiqh. So you have Usul al-Fiqh covers these essential things. You have the Ahkam, the conceptualization of the different categories of Ahkam. And the reason for this is because if Fiqh is the study of Ahkam, then we need to have a conceptual understanding of what Ahkam are. And we saw in the definition of Imam Juwayni that Usul Fiqh is turuquhu ala sabil al-ijmal. But basically, that means the categories of evidence, types of evidence that are admissible and can be used for deriving rulings attributed to the sharia. And in terms of the categories of evidence, types of evidence, Imam al-Ghazali has divided them into two main categories. One is agreed upon evidences, and then there are disputed categories of evidence, meaning some scholars say that this is a valid type of evidence, others say that it's not. So amongst the agreed on, muttafaq alayhi, this is kitab, sunnah, and ijma'. Also istishab, which is the assumption of continuity, which is an issue that inshallah will come up in Waraqat. It's basically a rational principle that is applied in conjunction with the texts of the Quran and Sunnah to extend rulings that have been derived from the Quran and Sunnah. But note in particular, he mentions Kitab, Sunnah, and Ijma. You'll note that Qiyas is missing from this list here. But Qiyas is frequently mentioned by many of the Usuliyin as one of the adilla that are muttafaq alayha, that are agreed on. Although obviously we know that there is the dispute with the Zahiris. The scholars of the Zahiri madhab say that Qiyas is not a hujjah, it is not a valid form of evidence, and we do not accept Qiyas. There is this dispute there, but in spite of that, many of the scholars have said that Qiyas counts amongst the adilla that are muttafaq alayha, that are agreed upon, because those who said that it is not, their opinion has no weight anyways, and that already well before then there was consensus on this, and some go as far as to say that anyone who does not consider qiyas to be evidence, anyone who does not consider qiyas to be hujjah in the sharia, this person is not a faqih anyhow. So his opinion has no weight. We'll have opportunity to discuss a little bit more about qiyas. And then he lists various forms of evidence that are disputed. You have, for example, qawl sahabi. Qawl sahabi famously is hujjah according to most Usuliyin, but not according to the Shafi'is, and some other issues that are listed here as examples. Then you have qawaid al-istinbat, which is the methods for deducing rulings from the evidence. And he divides this into three major categories. Dalalat al-mantuq, which is or I think the term used was actually mantuq. It's typically known as al-mantuq, which is the meanings that are taken from the actual words of the text. Then you have dalalat al-mafhum, which are certain types of dalalat, certain categories of meanings that are implied by the texts. And the method of knowing them is a linguistic method, meaning it's not explicitly stated in the text, but it is understood from the text, and it is a linguistic process of deriving these meanings from the text, or process of using linguistic reasoning. And then you have what he calls dalalat al-ma'qul, which is their meanings of the text that are arrived at by the use of reasoning. In particular, he means legal reasoning. Legal reasoning helps us to understand that there are certain meanings that are present here in the text that are not stated. And so this basically is qiyas. So the reason he has not listed qiyas under al-adilla al-muttafaq alayha is not because he's doubtful or because he accepts that there is a legitimate or strong khilaf about the validity of qiyas, but because he considers qiyas as one of the methods of deducing rulings from evidence. Because the Quran and Sunnah, we take rulings from the text of the Quran and Sunnah. Those rulings could be taken from the language of the text, or they could be taken from the legal implications of the text. So, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ says, "La yahkum al-qadi, la yahkum al-hakim wa huwa ghadban," a judge should not give ruling while he is angry. The idea is very clear, that a judge should not give ruling while he is angry, because his anger might cloud his judgment. And so then this is something that is fairly obvious. Meaning here is fairly obvious, that this is the purpose. This is the purpose of this rule. And so we can then extend this ruling to other things that this text does not apply to in a linguistic sense, but having understood the legal purpose of this ruling, based on our knowledge of the sharia, the principles of the sharia, and the purposes that underlie the rulings that are given in the sharia text, we're able to infer the purpose behind this ruling and then extend it to anything that would basically render a judge in a disturbed state of mind, that would cloud his judgment. So if he's extremely hungry, extremely thirsty, or in some other way emotionally affected or mentally affected, that all of these are situations in which he should not give ruling, even though this is not something that was stated in the text. This is by qiyas. So this is actually a meaning that is coming from the texts. And so it is a method of deducing rulings from the Quran and from the Sunnah, just the same way that deducing rulings from the language of the Quran and Sunnah, from the linguistic implications of the text of the Quran and Sunnah, is a method of deriving evidence from the Quran. So, so basically, this third column this is dealing with, once we've identified what the evidences are, dealing with how do we then properly analyze those evidences to derive rulings from them. And since this task of deriving rulings from evidence is the task of a mujtahid, it's fitting to know who is a mujtahid and who is a muqallid, in some aspects relating to istihad. So this is basically a basic of what constitutes usul al-fiqh. We'll have opportunity, inshallah, with our next lesson to come back and revisit what is usul al-fiqh, and these categories of evidence, where do they come from, how are they arrived at. Okay. There was a question. What is a solid way to define tawatur? Because it isn't only dependent on the number of people agreeing on a fact, right? Because there are cases where a large number of people can agree on something, but it's false. So it doesn't have to be a fact that is largely unchallenged. The idea of tawatur is that it is something that has been transmitted by a large group of people, under circumstances such that the possibility that they colluded to fabricate this report is inconceivable. That could be a small number, depending on the circumstance, or it could be a very large number. Also, the possibility that one of them made a mistake and the others have taken it from him is also inconceivable. So basically, the idea of tawatur is that looking at this particular report, that we are dealing with, the notion that that possibly collusion took place or that it is an error is inconceivable. So there is no definition of it beyond that. Oftentimes in Arabic, this is expressed as yes, رواية جمع عن جمع يستحيل تواطؤهم على الكذب أو الخطأ. The idea that التواتر is ضروري is in and of itself, there's some dispute concerning it. Is tawatur ضروري, or can tawatur be nothing? Or is tawatur nothing? The second part that you're mentioning here, large number, and the conditions that would allow for lying. يستحيل to this is what is intended by يستحيل tawatur. How is that istihala arrived at? Depends on the circumstances and the nature of the transmission. So it could be a smaller number in certain conditions, or a larger number in other conditions. Okay, so okay, no more questions. Okay. صلى الله وسلم